the pale blue dot.
You're on the show, mate.
Okay, cool.
Welcome to my mate podcast. Is this your first show?
Yeah.
Yeah, first show ever. Do you listen to podcasts?
I do. I do.
What are your go-tos?
Mainly I listen to Sounds True.
Okay.
Because they have lots of really interesting thinkers. Because I have often conferences and they have lots of really interesting thinkers talking about lots of different topics.
Yeah. Beautiful. So Sounds True.
Sounds True.
Is it? Oh.
So it's actually free. You can actually, if you listen 24 hours of it being kind of put online, you don't have to pay for it.
No.
But they're really, some of the kind of wisest voices coming from America, I think, and around the world.
Yeah.
On different topics, but they really connect the spiritual, psychological, which I find really intriguing.
Yeah, definitely. So do I. I think spirituality is fascinating because it's such a big part of people's lives and has been for so many hundreds of thousands of years. To discount the benefit of spirituality in its entirety just because we're more atheistic as a society in this day and age is ignorant, but we will get into all that. But yeah, do you want to just give the listeners and the watchers a bit of a brief introduction of who you are and what you do and what your favourite colour is?
Okay, so I guess I work primarily as a psychotherapist, but I guess my interest in spirituality has kind of been around for a long time, and so I guess I've tried to learn how to kind of bridge the two and try and help people to kind of make sense of both their psychological and spiritual experiencing, and I guess, starting to also understand the interrelationship between the two. So as we start to change psychologically through healing our trauma or working with our woundedness, connecting into part of our inner world and our spiritual world, it starts to kind of illuminate itself through this kind of unfolding experience. So really what I try and do is help map it out for people and start to make sense of what they're experiencing, primarily in their body or their inner world. Yeah.
And how did you, because it is a left of centre field, how did you, what opened you up to it?
Well, I think, there's lots of different things that happened, but primarily I think I was probably a little bit disenfranchised with mainstream systems and thinking, I guess, and I guess inside myself I knew there was something more, but I didn't know what it was. So I guess it sent me in an exploration of what that possibly could be, reading different writers and authors, and but I think I started to seek out teachers, and so that's kind of what I did. I think in my mid-20s when I had a few kind of really strong experiences of not knowing myself and wanting to know myself. So I started seeking out different people and asking questions, and but mostly what I think I started to learn was that you can learn things intellectually, but when you actually experience it experientially, meaning in the body, and you have a felt sense relationship with this kind of unfolding experience, it takes it to a whole different understanding inside yourself. Because you can form ideas and you can listen to people talk about their own experiences, but they're only thoughts and ideas, and until they're embodied or they're experienced in your own body, it's very hard to kind of make sense of some of those ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think the way, not to get political or anything, but the way society is for all its benefits, it is difficult to get to know yourself, to find yourself, as you say, because it's so hard to find that time to yourself.
Well, and I think also, because I think, we're both left brain, right brain, and I think most of our systems kind of help us to really excel in our left brain. So, very linear thinking, and, right from school, right through, university and into work life. Our right brain isn't really developed. I mean, it is a little bit in the periphery for some of the artistic things that, we do at school, but really I don't really understand ourselves through that right brain.
Yeah, that's such a good point, isn't it? It's funny. Can you give the listeners just like a basic breakdown of the differences between the left and the right?
Well, look, I think they're both connected, and I'm no neuroscience expert, but what I guess I come to understand is that there is real sort of differences between the way we operate in the world through left and right brain, and I think what I've come to understand working with people is that some of us are more naturally geared to our left brain or more geared to their right brain. So and I think but our experiencing through left brain or right brain is very different, and I think from what I understand, like early developmental of self, it's like our right brain, the way we connect as an infant to mother is through our right brain more than, because our left brain hasn't quite developed yet.
Yeah.
So that's why, you know, some of those really early interactions with mum and parent become so important in the child's development. But also, you know, that's where a lot of trauma can get stuck too. So that's why I think a lot of the trauma is stuck in the body that's connected to the right brain, and that's why we can't always just process it top down, meaning from linear, trying to change our behaviour and our actions, but bottom up means that we have to kind of sometimes experience the trauma that gets stuck in our body to kind of understand how it's impacted our life and the way that we internalise ourselves through our adult experiences. Because all those experiences that happen, right, you know, early on, they start to form who we are, and they become quite unconscious. And so part of like bringing them into consciousness is starting to know, you know, the trauma that we suffered and how that's impacted, you know, the way we live our life.
Yeah, it's about going down to those depths to find the basis of who you are.
Yeah.
As opposed to, and you can only do that by spending time, I don't know, just getting to know yourself a bit more, you know, things like that. Do you have any sort of self-practices that sustain that kind of self-knowing?
Well, I think, I do. I get people to the processing creatively. So what I might get them to do is say, you know, because when we start to work through this material, I mean, the left brain becomes important because that creates a narrative and helps us to understand our experiences, but the right brain is what helps us to process and get in contact with. So, you know, using drawing or writing or even movement through dance or some sort of expression to help people to really explore the right brain connection to, you know, the trauma that's trapped in the body, but also, you know, their wisdom, because again, it's all interconnected. Yeah. So really what I help people do is work through their trauma and you know, connecting to what I call their higher self, but you know, the higher self just being the aspect of them which is their own wisdom. Yeah.
Is it like the awareness of that? So as opposed to fundamentally defining yourself based upon your traumas, because like who you are is just you're walking around and you're not happy with yourself. The higher self is the ability to be aware of why you are the way you are. Also, I don't know.
Well, yeah. Look,
it's a deep topic.
I think it's quite a philosophical question. You know, but I think it's kind of separating ourselves from ego to spirit. Yeah. But I guess, you know, the way I see the higher self manifest itself in people is this kind of overriding wisdom that can almost be the observer that sits above the trauma and help to kind of make sense of some of those experiences and help guide them in, you know, moving forward in a different kind of way. So it's more about helping people to connect into their own wisdom and their own truth, which, you know, because I think also when people suffer from trauma, they get stuck in repetitive negative thinking about certain things, and that negative thinking then sort of, you know, responds to emotional responses in the body, and this is the trauma pattern that keeps happening to them. And so it's really hard to get out of that loop once we get stuck in it, because it becomes so normalized and we don't understand ourselves separate from that. So the wiser voice inside us just helps to kind of create a bit more distance from the trauma, but also gives us a bit more understanding of how to navigate the murkiness of, you know, the unconscious and the trauma. And a part of that is, you know, reconnecting into our spiritual wisdom.
What about for people that come to you, if they do come to you, or just anyone out there that's listening that's like, that wants to do this sort of work, and it is challenging work.
It is challenging,
but maybe because of prejudice or assumption, doesn't like the word spirituality. Like, could you perhaps define spirituality for a modern audience or something like that?
Well, I think, look, I guess spirituality is a kind of complex thing, because, you know, we all have different experiences of what spirituality is, and I think, you know, there's obviously the religious perspective of spirituality, there's a New Age perspective of spirituality, so, you know, there's so many different lenses in which to experience it. I guess the way I kind of see it more as a personal relationship we have to something inside ourselves rather than outside ourselves. So it's about learning about what spirituality is, again, through this experiential understanding of making contact with something inside ourselves that is bigger than ourselves, but at the same time not. Because, you know, if you look at it as being both spiritual and physical, then, you know, it's part of actually who we are. So we're really just reconnecting into something that's already within us. But it's taking away that externalization and seeing it as something out there, but landing it back inside ourselves and forming a personal relationship with that.
Yeah, definitely. And again, like, I don't want to fall back onto the society thing again, but I just imagine, 500, 600 years ago, when it was nighttime, and it was darkness, you know, and even just reducing the overwhelming sensation of sight, you become to know yourself a little bit more because there's not so much going on out here. So even just closing your eyes, like, oh, okay, what's going on in here? But it's difficult. Have you ever been to New York? You seen what it's like there? Oh, no, mate, walk around in New York Times, up in the in Times Square, and it's just like, what am I doing? Like, there's nothing going on in here, you know? It's crazy. Exactly. Oh, exactly. And I think now, this is what is fascinating to me is, you know, meditation is really starting to kick off in the Western world, really because the imbalance, because we've been becoming so externalized that we have to do it, you know, that's why at least. But even now, you know, you can buy apps and things, so they're even marketing self-awareness time to us. It's fascinating, you know. If we went back to that idea of things we can do to, I guess, start walking the path towards self-exploration, could you give us a few tips and things, and then maybe like why you like those as well?
Well, I think, obviously things like meditation are helpful because it starts to kind of, I guess, move from that external experience of self and start to sort of land inside ourselves. And, you know, when I talk about, you know, meditation, I talk about the monkey mind and sort of recognizing that, you know, the monkey mind is a lot of this noise going on inside us. And so it prevents us from landing deeper into, you know, this experiential parts of self. So I think, you know, any process that helps us to kind of reflect or come towards our inner self, you know, creativity is another thing, like, you know, for dance, ecstatic dance, or through, you know, artistic expression, you know, whatever that might be, or movement, or it's just anything that really engages that right brain, I think.
Yeah.
You know, and starts to slow ourselves so that we can be really present in the moment and not, you know, getting this constant tug into the past or pull into the future, because, I mean, that's what really stops us from being aware. And sometimes, you know, I might be just going to nature, you know, and just sitting with nature, sitting on a rock, looking at the ocean.
Yeah.
You know, it's these moments which takes us really back into the present moment that can help us to connect with ourselves.
And the only thing that's actually real, which is the present. The past is an illusion, the future's not yet happened, you know. Yeah, definitely. The way that really helps me see it is the trying to do things that have means without ends. Yeah. So, like, you know, the classic, like, if you had $1 million, what would you do? You know, if you could think of like anything where you enjoy doing it just because you enjoy doing it, and there's no extrinsic value. There's no kind of like, I do it because hopefully one day I will, or I hope, you know, because then A, B, and C, my life will be easier. It really does come down to creativity, isn't it? And I think the expression of dance is an expression in and of itself. It's not like I'm doing this dance so that I can. So I'm literally, every time I move my arm, every time I sway to the beat, I'm just doing it because I'm just doing it. It's very hard for us to do that in this day and age. We're so time oriented, you know. What are some things that kind of help you find that creative aspect in yourself?
Well, I mean, obviously time, you know, is obviously an important aspect. I think, you know, living in such a busy world, it can be difficult, but I guess it's just putting that time aside, in your evenings or something, instead of watching the TV.
Yeah, it's important.
Yeah, look, there's no judgment on TV, but again, you know, it's like valuable time that we could be, you know, engaging in ourselves in a different way. You know, but you're right. I mean, it is difficult in our modern society for people to slow down, because I think, in a way, it's gotten faster with time.
Yeah.
People are more busy now than they used to be, and you know, it's like got phones and all these things distracting us away from you know, being with ourselves, and you know, I think it's quite a big issue that you know, I mean, we've all as individuals need to make the choice ourselves to kind of connect to ourselves differently.
Definitely, and it's almost that thing now. It's like, well, yeah, I get it. I just want to be spiritual now. I want to be like enlightened now. And so you got to sift through it, the swamplands. What about, okay, so you were mid-20s, you wanted to kind of start to explore that inner world a little bit more.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you looked to some teachers and you started reading specific authors. Like, what was something that helped you the most?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, you know, I mean, if they're like old books now, but it was like the Celestine Prophecy. I think it was one of the first books
Oh, shit.
I read.
Who's that by?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't even remember.
Celestine.
Yeah. And there's like the Way of the Peaceful Warrior, I think.
Oh, yeah, Dan Millman.
Dan Millman.
That's a brilliant book.
That was a good one. Yeah, I mean, look, they were probably some of the primary books, but again, I think, you know, it was mainly through my own experiential journey. I think I went to New Zealand at that time, and I met a guy over there who, you know, and again, like, because I wanted, and I didn't really know where to look, so I found like a hands-on Reiki healer.
Oh, yeah.
And so I learned Reiki, you know, that was kind of my starting point, I guess, and starting to understand, you know, about energy and how it moves, and, you know, but then I think as I went along, I sought out different teachers, and I got into shamanism, and I sat in shamanic circles, and I did lots of kind of workshops where, you know, using breath work and altered state work, you know, and then I studied holistic healing and hypnotherapy, because I mean, hypnotherapy was really interesting, and you know, when we talk about, you know, about being present before, I was kind of reflecting on, you know, I think sometimes why it's so hard for us to be really present is because when there's unresolved trauma from the past, it still exists inside our body and as part of ourselves. And this is probably a really hard concept for most people to understand, but when I was learning hypnotherapy, what I saw was that people would regress to being a child again.
Wow. And
remembering stuff that they experienced. And it's not like they were just remembering being a child, they were that child.
Wow.
They talked like the 5-year-old self, and they remembered things from their 5-year-old self, and they're feeling emotions and expressing feelings as a 5-year-old.
Wow.
And it was one of the most strangest experiences, but it really helped to solidify me this understanding that you know, all of these parts of our experiences still exist inside us.
Yeah. And
sometimes when, you know, we call it triggered, meaning that when some part of us which is unresolved gets kind of triggered through an external experience, it's like we can, what I call, regress to being in that child state. You know, and sometimes when we act irrationally, emotionally, that's what's happening to us. You know, we're actually living that part of our unresolved experience in our body in that moment.
God, that's crazy. And you say regress back to childhood, is there like a time frame where, so how, God, I've got a bunch of questions coming out here.
Yeah, look, it's a pretty amazing concept.
It's just absolutely mind-blowing. But, because I've heard that before when hypnotherapists talk about, you know, a doorway through to the subconscious mind. I know for me, dream analysis has been pivotal in kind of understanding myself, and more often than not, I'm thrown back into childhood experiences, you know, and I was just wondering if there's like a time frame through childhood where trauma gets stuck or continue to get stuck. Like, is it beyond the age of 10, consciousness, like self-awareness starts to form, or do you know what I'm trying to ask? Yeah.
It could actually probably happen from when you're in the womb onwards.
Wow.
So, you know, I've had people go back to experience themselves, being born, like what happened to them in being born. I remember one person I worked with, it was like she started choking and it's like she remembered that she had the cord trapped around her neck in utero.
She remembered that? Because
her cells remembered it.
Yeah, her cells,
Yeah. So it's like, because you don't have language and you don't have a lineal brain at that phase, and the first 2 years of your life, we call these implicit memories because they're in the body, but we sometimes can only experience it through the body and not through language. And so by experiencing it through the body, we understand the trauma that's stuck.
God damn, that is unbelievable. Yeah.
It is incredible. It's incredible that all these kind of memories of our life and our experience are still in our body. But
and I just imagine how overwhelming that would be for a client to go through that. Like, incredibly healing, incredibly powerful. But you have someone that comes to a space like this, or comes to and sees a hypnotherapist, and is incredibly linear, works, is a potential bureaucrat. Nothing against bureaucrats, but it's very much like...
Very much in their left brain.
Exactly. Like we have been conditioned to be,
Exactly.
And then you start breaking down these internal traumatic walls, and you start to realise that you have all these memories, somatic experiences left from the past, how that would shift a person's perception of reality. Is where the counselling side of things comes into it, just to kind of guide them through that. It's like, now you've seen this internal world, like, let's try to work through it so you don't go insane.
Well, I think, you make an interesting point there, because I think what's important to kind of recognise here is the power of beliefs, both spiritually and in this kind of unfolding experience, because not everybody's able all the time to kind of let go into these experiences, both spiritually and experientially in the body. Because if there is a very strong belief about being, in your left brain, and you're very much kind of feel safe and secure in that, you can thwart any of these kind of unfolding experiences. So I think when people come to me that are more very much kind of in that left brain, I probably would just talk to them about their experiences, rather than doing any experiential stuff, because I know that they're not ready to kind of let go into that, because there is a bit of a letting go process.
Yes.
Because it's almost like that left linear brain has to become the observer of the right brain's experiencing. But what you find is that if feelings start to come up in people when they get scared, that left brain can shut it down. Yeah,
wow, yeah. Because, as much as we love the left side of things is understanding, and this is this is this is this.
That's right.
A tree is a tree. A tree is not a didgeridoo.
No, that's right.
Just think a didgeridoo. And then when fear is bad. Let's run away from it. That's crazy.
Yeah.
And so talk to us about the shamanic stuff that you were doing as well. You were doing that before the hypnotherapy?
Well, I think, it's probably around a similar time. It might have been just prior to. I think a lot of the shamanic stuff's really interesting. What I became interested with shamanic things is that I started to recognise that a lot of cultures, like a lot of old cultures around the world, were all doing similar kind of practices without having any relationship with each other. So I thought, that's really interesting, because, it's not like they were meeting up and talking about it, saying, hey, practice this and
sending emails.
Sending emails. Or, even, but I think, it kind of made me think about, the collective unconscious and how, because as you said before, these people probably weren't distracted by modern life. They were maybe more connected to their themselves and the relationship with the spirit world. And so, look, when you do lots of reading into shamanic side of things, you could see that they were doing similar things.
Yeah. And what are those things?
Well, look, they vary from culture to culture, but I think some of the really interesting stuff that I kind of learned was they kind of work a lot more with, I guess shamanically it's like they kind of see themselves as having a foot in each world. And just to kind of qualify that, I think it's not that, everybody who was in these kind of tribal worlds were shamans. The shamans were the ones that kind of lived at the periphery of the town. The people who got sick, because they didn't always have doctors and other people, they always went to the shamans to kind of heal them. And the shamans, you know, I mean, they obviously had probably, you know, herbal medicines and other things, but I think also, you know, what was really interesting is that they use a lot of trance state to try and access, I think, you know, what I understood, you know, because again, you know, I don't know intricacies of exactly what they did, but because it's all kind of, you know, second-hand knowledge in a way, but it was almost like, you know, when we talked about, you know, those young parts and the trauma, I got the feeling that what they did was that they would almost travel through the spirit world to get something back and bring it back to the person, say maybe a lost soul essence or some part of it that had got missing. But I'll tell you what really interests me about shamanism was that I think it's our relationship to the natural world. And I think, you know, we've lost contact with, you know, Earth being a living organism, that we're intimately connected to it through our bodies, which have obviously come from the Earth.
Yeah.
And I think the wisdom of the Earth exists inside our bodies. So, you know, when I'm doing the psychological work, you know, the other part other than the higher self is, you know, things what I call, well, what people connect to is like the power animal. And, you know, say tribal guides, and I know this sounds very esoteric and, you know, people might not really understand what I'm talking about, but I'm not talking about the like the new age version of this. What I'm talking about is the embodied experience of connecting to like our primal energies, which shows itself in an animal form.
Yes.
You know, and each of these animals has its own medicine, which we can learn through our embodied sense of connecting into these animals, and it can again help us to kind of navigate our own trauma and move differently into the world to kind of understand, you know, that we're an energetic being.
Yeah.
And, you know, because what happens in trauma is that sometimes when people suffer really serious developmental trauma, they have a split in their psyche where their vulnerable parts, or the parts or the needs that they have which aren't being met through the relationship, you know, with mum and dad, for example, they almost have to kind of protect themselves by kind of hiding that away and developing what I call a defended self. That's the physical armouring that we have in the body, but also what we resort to when we feel threatened. Like, again, you know, when I talk about that triggered aggressive place, that's what more people go to, is their defended self.
Yes.
Which is like a really young protective strategy to kind of protect ourselves from being hurt or wounded.
Yeah.
You know, it happens to us very unconsciously.
Very, yeah.
So the idea of the animal is to kind of experience, you know, because through this work what we're doing is we're starting to connect into our sensitivity in our body and our vulnerability, but we're also developing different ways to protect ourselves energetically, so we're not, you know, so vulnerable in that part of us that's being wounded. So rather than just being in the defensive armour in the body, which we know and is very normal, but what tends to happen is it also becomes a bit like our prison.
Yeah.
Because it narrows our world and narrows our experience to try and create that safe place. But I think the power animal, it gives us a way to kind of interact with it differently. So it creates like a way in which we can, I guess through our own sense of growing spiritual power, protect our vulnerability, so that our vulnerability can emerge, but also our fierceness can emerge.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me, definitely. And, you know, we, so much of us is the primitive animal. It's the monkey mind. It's, you know, this meat suit, and you know, the emotional mind was there long before the logical mind, and we do spend a lot of our time reacting, you know, from fears and, you know, about, you know, you think about like a, I don't know, what's a really good idea of an animal. I don't know, like a little echidna or something in the wild. You know, when it gets hungry, its cortisol increases, probably gets a little bit of anxiety and starts looking at, you know, just narrow-minded vision for food. When it gets that food, it eats, and then, you know, the brainwaves come down, the narrow-minded is a lot more open now, and the anxiety goes away. All that sort of stuff, you know. We have all of that in us. We just have this other mind as well that's kind of like, can be, if you build on it, aware of that. It's just so, it's about, I think, becoming more aware of, you know, the impulses, the desires, the fears, all these things that are emanating from and triggered by potentially the subconscious mind.
Right.
How is it when you are trying to work through a process of releasing trauma?
Yeah.
Can you reach a state where literally that trauma is no longer there, or can you just get to a stage where you're very aware and it's integrated? Like, would you still get the intrusive thoughts, or do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Look, I think, when we look at that, I think, the ideas around neuroscience kind of paint a picture of making sense of that, because I think, we can't obviously undo the trauma of the past.
Yes.
It's kind of formed our body and who we are. Because sometimes I think, like if we see ourselves like a tree, right? So a tree is kind of growing as this little sapling, and then as a tree gets bigger and bigger, and if it has to bend and get around things, and it gets, the environment kind of impacts it, the tree will adjust itself to kind of survive in its environment. And I think, we're exactly the same. So
that's a great analogy.
So we have that kind of imprint in our body that we'll always have, but I think what happens, and because we've got such an incredible brain, is we create new pathways of experience. So we create new neural pathways of experiencing ourselves. And I think as we have repeated positive experiences of experiencing ourselves in a different way, separate from the trauma, we can start to, it's almost like, if you think of it like a railway track, we move into a different railway track in which we experience ourselves. The old one's still there, but we're just not on that same cycle repeating it, because we're experiencing ourselves so different, and again, this is where, because I mean, it all gets quite complex, but when we look at relational trauma, what we say is that a lot of trauma happens in relationship, and that's what kind of creates these embodied senses of self. And so sometimes we can only heal it through having a different type of relationship. Yeah. Because the understanding around trauma is, right, that, when we get traumatized through this developmental trauma, it's like our unconscious tries to heal the trauma by recreating the trauma in our adult life.
I was just going to ask this, yeah.
Yeah, so we experience the trauma in hope of having a different outcome, but what inevitably happens to most people is they get re-traumatized over and over again.
You can think of the classic example of someone who always tends to go out with the same sort of person.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what we're kind of talking about here. Or is attracted to a partner that's very reflective of the traumatizing mother or father.
Yes.
And embodies similar kind of attributes or treats them in a certain way.
Wow, yeah. Is that what Freud was talking about with the Oedipus complex?
Well, look, I don't know much about Freud. I mean, I've obviously heard of that, but I think, I can't really comment on the Oedipal.
Yeah, I think it was something like Oedipus. I think it was just a Greek myth where he got really resentful of his dad, and he killed his dad or something, and ended up going out with his mother. And it's like, I think the idea is, he was never able to detach himself from his childhood needs or something like that. Is that still relevant? Because we don't. I mean, definitely as males, we don't have initiation rites and things like that anymore.
Well, no, that's true.
I'm just wondering how relevant that sort of stuff is still today.
Yeah, look, I don't know if I can really comment on that. I think a lot of psychotherapy's moved beyond a lot of Freud's ideas.
Yeah, it's true.
And I think, there's been a lot of incredible people that have grown from his initial teachings, but it's kind of evolved in different ways. And I know a lot of people still really value Freud's work, and that's why it's hard to comment on, because I haven't read enough of Freud's work to kind of be able to say whether that's applicable or not. But what I can tell you is that what I understand around trauma is that when it does happen in relationship, is that it does get embedded in our body, and as I said, that split between our vulnerable needs, because what happens is we hide our needs, and even as an adult we hide those needs away because we're so scared of being re-wounded, and we kind of hide ourselves in our defensive structure.
Yeah.
But that's what often recreates a lot of these recreated trauma patterns.
Yes.
Because this need is still there, but we're not owning it, and so it kind of pushes through in our unconscious trying to get that need met.
Wow.
But then we're attracted to people that can never meet that need. And that's a recreation of the trauma. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, the new neural pathways, which I mentioned before, is like we can experience ourselves separate from this repeated experience. But to do that, we have to have the embodied understanding of what happened to us, both in the needs that have been kind of hidden away,
Yeah.
and how we've defended against them by armoring up and protecting ourselves in our body.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sometimes we need those spiritual resources to be able to work through all of this stuff.
Yeah.
To kind of master it in ourselves.
God, it's fascinating. What about what can a parent do to minimize the amount of trauma that their child goes through? I mean, I've got two questions. Like, I guess kind of like the paradox with trauma is that the more traumatized we are, the more we've been through. Like, is there like a resilience aspect to how much trauma you go through, to how much you can handle in the modern world?
I think there's two edges to trauma.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, it's interesting because, what I see in a lot of people is this concept around intergenerational trauma, right?
Yeah.
So that's the idea that, the trauma patterns that are experienced in the family is re-experienced from generation to generation, because it's kind of been so normalized and embodied in each person that it just gets passed on. So again, this kind of creates a bit of distancing too. So once we can start to understand our own trauma is interconnected to, say our own parents' trauma, it also helps us to kind of understand that, perhaps our parents are traumatized as well.
Definitely.
As ourselves, and they did the best they could.
Definitely.
With what resources they had. Because I think a lot of, at first, there's a lot of anger and resentment towards the offending parent, but I think once we get to the point of having a bit more compassion and understanding because of that, that ongoing trauma pattern, it gives us a bit of liberation from, how personal the wounding is.
Yes. You begin to, God, it's so like personally weird that you said that, just given the current situation. But I love it. You can begin to try to see things from their side and like, okay, look, I totally get where you were coming from with this. It's about open, honest communication with that as well, though, if you want to heal. Because can you have, that sounds to me like it's interpersonal trauma, which is difficult because it involves someone else. Yeah.
Well, that's what I mean by relational trauma.
Oh, relational trauma, yeah, definitely. Right.
Yeah, because part of what I learned when I studied psychotherapy was self-psychology and intersubjectivity. So that's a very relational psychoanalysis method of understanding, how trauma happens in a relationship. It gave a really incredible framework to understanding that.
Yeah.
And especially the, how self-psychology moved into intersubjectivity, it kind of gave us a real kind of, strong understanding about the importance of relationship in therapy too.
So is intersubjectivity developing a personal relationship with the client as well, like opening up your vulnerability too?
Well, look, it is within reason.
Yeah.
Because you obviously, again, have to be really mindful about the dynamic in the relationship and the trauma that they're holding.
Yes.
And not playing into that.
Yes.
Because, obviously, Freud again talked about transference.
Yes.
Transference, and that's always a bit of a complexity with therapy, and especially a kind of a relational-based therapy.
Yeah.
So that's why I think also, as a therapist, doing your own work becomes so important, because then you have more understanding of all those trigger points in you, and you don't get kind of enmeshed in transference.
You don't take it home with you, so to speak.
Don't take it home with you.
Yeah.
But what I liked about the intersubjective model is that, because I think therapy, especially in the early days, it was based on the therapist being the kind of like the mirror, almost like not really in a relationship at all, and so the person is lying on the couch, you can see the old model, and it's
talking about
their experiences. But the therapist is sitting there writing notes and yes, and all
that.
But I think the new version of it is just it's almost like us here, two human beings connecting, and so in a way, yes, you're bringing your own vulnerability into the work, and you're being a human being connecting to another human being.
Definitely. Because Freud's idea was the whole free association method as well, wasn't it? It was just letting the mind wander and letting the words wander and see what pops up.
And I think that's the right brain stuff coming into action.
Yes.
You know, he might have just stumbled onto that idea to access, you know, the memories in the right brain by not talking in a linear way, but just letting the language just come out.
Yeah.
Not trying to censor it.
Yeah, exactly. Yep, which is, it is censored a lot, you know. We're often censored by things we think we shouldn't say and things we think we should say, and the persona aspect. So when did once you moved through your own process of healing and, you know, personal understanding, when did you kind of come to the decision, or maybe it was a gradual decision, that you actually wanted to pursue this as a profession as well? Because this is how we actually got in contact. I wanted to
that's right.
Understand you more, you know.
Yeah.
Try to understand myself.
yeah. Well, look, I think, you know, it's a really interesting question, because I think in a way, you know, it might sound a bit silly, but it kind of chose me.
Yeah.
I don't know what I was looking for, you know, right at the start, and I didn't even know what it meant to be a therapist, really, because, you know, when you leave school and you're moving in life, you know, I mean, there's psychology and there's psychiatry, and you know, that didn't resonate with me. Being a right brain person, you know,
totally.
I really excelled in creative things like art and so forth. So I was kind of, you know, I didn't know what to do, and so I think it was like an ongoing process. And I think when I studied at Lifeline, you know, I did their course, and I did a bit of telephone counselling.
Oh, nice.
But when I was there studying, it's like something landed in me, and I thought, there's something feels really right. You know? And it wasn't that, but it awoke something in me and say, you know, this is where I want to move towards.
Yeah.
You know, and I think, you know, also when I was learning, you know, Reiki, I mean, it was obviously just all for me to kind of understand this stuff. It's not that I wanted to become a hands-on healer or do any of this stuff, because I didn't even know if I believed in it.
Yeah.
I mean, I was just exploring to see what it all was.
Yes.
And I was open, you know, I didn't know.
Yeah.
You know, but I think the more I did, and then when I did the breathwork stuff, and I became really curious about my own psyche and how it worked, and then I became curious about other people's. And I wanted to kind of see what happened, you know. So then I started exploring, you know, in learning, you know, as I said, I studied holistic healing, and then I studied hypnotherapy, and so then I just started, people started coming to me. It was funny because I think people came to me and said, you know, can you work with me? I said, okay. You know, and then word of mouth would happen, then someone would call me and say, hey, I heard you did this for this person, you interested? And I was like, okay.
Yeah.
And then
$20.
yeah, well, that's right. And
Yeah.
it just happened that way for me, because I think before that, you know, again, it was just all very personal. It was like I was on a journey to kind of understand myself. So I think after a while that happened, but it was interesting because, you know, I started doing this work, and then I think some of the transference stuff, because I hadn't studied psychotherapy at that point. Yeah. And I found it really hard to navigate.
Yeah, definitely. You know? I love what you said before, how, and I want to unpack it, because it is like a woo-woo thing to say, but if you do unpack it, I think it is really insightful. When you said before that it chose me, I was doing a bit of writing about this as well, and the idea behind it, I guess, is like, no matter how hard you try, like an artist, let's just say an artist, you know, a painter, really likes the idea of being like a highly qualified mathematician, you know.
Yeah.
For someone that actually wants to be a mathematician and is doing all that work, they're going to be so much better than a painter, because they actually enjoy the process, and that their mind works like that and all that stuff. And it's almost, they're kind of like being pulled to this thing that they just do anyway. They just know it, you know. But, you know, as it sounded like it was for you, and I think it is for me. Like, the more I'm hearing that scene, the more, you know, you're talking about trauma and all this stuff. I'm like, fuck yeah, this sounds great. You know, you're just being pulled into this world constantly, where it's like, by the end of it, in that journey, you couldn't have ever done anything else.
No, that's right.
It was just for you.
Yeah.
You know, and it sounded like it was pulling you there.
Well, I think what kind of happens is, you know, I love the idea around paradigms, and I think, you know, I spoke about that last time, but, you know, I think what happened to me is I started to change as I was going through all this kind of inner exploration, and with being with different teachers, and I think when my paradigm shifted, I was like, suddenly I realised, and there was a real pivotal point, because I used to be an engineer, right?
Yeah. I used to be a mathematician.
Yeah, and and why it was so interesting is because, again, I was probably, being an engineer, I was much more in my left brain at that point in my life, and so I was kind of, observing everything, as I said, open, but looking through that skeptical left brain and saying, is this real?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
But what happened to me was, I think there was a point where I was working up in Queensland. I think I was in my late 20s at that point, and I had a teacher who really awakened a lot of stuff inside me, and that was a whole different experience. But when I came back to Melbourne, I got like a quite high-paid engineering job, and so part of that job was working in substations under buildings, and so we're putting fibre into the buildings and sort of, anyway. So
wow, yeah.
So I was taken into this under the building. They have what they call substations, which are these huge, big electric generators, and so we were just in there, and we're probably about 10 metres away from this generator, but something went fuzzy in my brain, and I passed out. I ended up in hospital that first night.
Oh, wow.
Wow, something's really changed in me here. And then I think I lasted another year at work, and I just found that I couldn't keep going in it. I had to do something different.
Yeah.
That's what really, I just realised I had to kind of let go, and move into this other paradigm, because something had shifted in me, and I wasn't even really fully conscious of what that was. But that was a real pivotal moment, because I think it kind of showed me very clearly.
Yeah, that's very very much aligned with that hero's journey idea. That once you try to go back to your old world,
yes,
it's just not you.
You can't.
You just can't. Yeah, definitely. And it's difficult to let go, man. Like, it's difficult to do what you did and just be like, hey, I can't do this anymore. A lot of people end up staying in that world because I think we forget that pain is actually like a signal. We forget that. So we wouldn't be a human being without, it's the whole polar opposite idea, without the environment to which we're very much engrossed in.
Yes.
We're not just a thing away from this biodiverse ecosystem. We are with it. We're one and the same.
That's right.
And you can put boxes and buildings up and all that sort of stuff, but there's still that relationship. Yeah. And I think that a cool takeaway from what you just said, at least the way I understand it, is that if you can start to listen to what your body is doing and how you're feeling in certain environments, it could be a good indicator of what you're actually doing. Is it right or is it wrong for you? People always say things like, I just fucking can't stand my job, the boss is a prick. It's it's an indicator, that something needs to happen there. Maybe you need to have a chat. Maybe he's not a prick. Maybe you just need to have a conversation. Or maybe that place isn't right for you,
Yeah.
And so you stayed there for a whole other year before you, speaking of listening to the signal, and then did you start moving into the counselling world?
Yeah.
Right, okay.
Yeah, well, I guess the thing is you sometimes don't know what you're moving towards, or where to even move to, because you don't really understand exactly what you're feeling.
Yes.
You're just feeling a dissatisfaction, but you don't know even what that dissatisfaction is.
And it's important, I think, not to rush that as well.
Absolutely.
You can't run into, I've got to do this now.
Yeah.
Man, it's fine not to know.
Yeah. Well, I always, when I'm taking people through this kind of inner work, because sometimes, they get to a point and go, I don't want to do my job anymore. I'm saying, well, obviously honour what you're feeling, but don't rush into actually quitting your job. It's like, just be mindful again, when you connect to your higher self, of knowing what your truth is and what the right decision is for you in this kind of moment. Because it's not necessarily, about abandoning and letting go of everything to kind of connecting to your spirituality.
Yes.
I think, this has been, I guess, the trap for a lot of people is that they think they have to give up everything to kind of connect into it, but I don't think that's true. I think, you can have both, but sometimes what you might find is that you need to move towards something different, but rather than forcing that, just allowing that to be a natural movement towards that's being informed by your body and your experience,
Mm.
rather than your mind.
Exactly right. Yeah, and maybe even just getting to a position where you can integrate the two, like people that
Yes.
are very entrepreneurial say that they can find that beautiful flow state where
Yep.
they actually are somatically aligned with what they're doing, but then their thinking mind helps them actually solve the problems. You know, they find that flow, which is beautiful. I would love everyone to be in that position, you know.
Yeah. Look, I definitely think, you know, the entrepreneurial way certainly has something going for it. You know, it's being able to kind of, you know, make your living doing something that's meaningful to you, but that also gives you the freedom to kind of orientate it in what works for you.
Yeah, definitely. That's awesome.
Because I think, you know, when we talk about paradigm shifts, you know, it's kind of like, you know, I think as a society, you know, we are potentially moving towards a paradigm shift, because it seems pretty self-evident that, you know, when you read a lot of stuff going out in the world at the moment, that something's not working right now, and that they don't know what to move towards.
Definitely. It's almost like I was listening to a podcast, and the guy Chris Ryan, who wrote Sex at Dawn, he said this. I thought it was a really cool idea. We're almost, as a collective, in like the innermost cave in the hero's journey. We've reached this point where you know, we're factory farming and we're trying to, you know, lead towards money. Everything's extrinsically motivated. We're in this bottom of the place where we've gone so far into a cave, they're like, holy shit, we've gone too far here. And the societal move now is coming back towards those primal states where everyone's talking about inner realities, you know, eating a more paleo diet, being about that tribal community sense. People are exploring open relationship, you know, all these things that were very much entrenched with the way human beings lived 500, 1,000, you know, 10,000 years ago. It's just, that's fascinating, that kind of circle coming back, you know, to what made us happy, as far as we can tell, you know.
Well, what made us happy, but also was sustainable.
It was sustainable. That's a much better word.
You know, because I think, you know, all creatures of Earth, you know, have to live in harmony with the Earth. You know, I mean, there's been plenty of stories where, you know, animals have eaten, you know, they've just multiplied and been too kind of strong, and then they've eaten themselves out of their own environment.
The hubris.
And then they've kind of had to adapt, or they've become extinct.
Yeah.
You know, and we're no different, you know, because we are, again, animals of the earth. The only difference is we have this kind of very powerful brain.
Yeah.
So, you know, but I think as a collective, as you said, are realising that we have to do things differently.
Yeah.
What that looks like, I guess none of us know quite yet.
Yeah.
But you know, I guess things like climate change are pushing us towards a different paradigm in which we operate in. Definitely. You know, and it reminds me, before I realised I didn't answer your question about trauma and and how we can kind of grow, because I think, you know, trauma is like a doorway into kind of knowing ourselves differently. So I try and frame trauma in a more positive way, in that, you know, that can sometimes also inform our strengths. And I think I realised that on my own personal level, is that a lot of my early trauma was actually a guide into my strengths, because it's almost as though it helps you as you work through it. It's like a muscle, you know, you have to work extra hard to kind of develop it, but when you develop it, it's like you have such a strong affiliation with that. You know, I mean, you hear stories of people who've come through trauma and then they make that their life mission
to help other
people who suffer similar trauma.
Yeah, 100%. And how would you do that? So, because I think for someone listening to this now, you know, that I think most of the listeners on this show are, you know, very much into the mind and all that sort of stuff. They have a trauma, they recognise something that maybe it's an intrusive thought, or you know, something that's consistently triggering them.
Or experiencing in their relationships.
Exactly right. Yeah, exactly right. Or they're stuck. You know, they're stuck.
Yeah.
Can you? Because I really like that idea of it can actually be a window into self-becoming, self-actualization. It could be a really positive thing.
Yes.
Could you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Well, I think it's about the healing, right? And it's kind of being able to kind of start to know self separately from the trauma. So I mean, how we do that, I think, you know, as you mentioned before, it kind of has to be relational often, especially if the trauma is relational, because we can't, you know, it's like, you know, the other thing that shamanism taught me is that we're all interconnected, you know, and we're connected to the earth. And so it's that interconnectedness and through helping moving differently with others, it gives us that kind of doorway into experiencing ourselves differently. So I guess, you know, I guess things like workshops can be useful, or groups where they get together, you know, there's lots of experiential dance places. I mean, obviously therapy is a really good place because a well-trained therapist will be able to hold the space and help people to safely work through some of that complex trauma that, you know, can be so murky and so confusing and so difficult to understand, and it takes time. And this is the hardest thing for people to understand. There is no quick way out of trauma, but we've got to start and move through it over time. And I think when people come to therapy, it's like they're hoping 3 or 4 sessions that they can shift some of this stuff.
And a multivitamin.
Well, yeah. I mean, but the reality is, you know, because trauma's happened over such a long period of time and it's been reinforced over many experiences, like, so you can imagine that somebody's been in one of these loops for 20, 30, 40 years of their life. You can't expect that loop to change into something different, you know, in a short period of time. So, you know, I think at the moment, I mean, therapy seems to be one of the best tools in which to kind of navigate some of this really complex material.
Yeah, and do you have like, if it is like a relational based trauma, you said that the shaman's, you know, very much interested in that idea of interconnectedness, sorry.
Yeah.
Is that, let's say you were traumatized by so-and-so's parents, like a friend's parents, when you were 6 years old. Is part of the recovery process actually seeking them out and having a conversation with them specifically? Or I imagine that would be hard to do.
Well, yeah, it can be hard to do. Look, it's a complex issue because I think, you know, especially because when we talk, I think it's important when we talk about trauma to differentiate between one-off traumas and relational trauma, because relational trauma is a repeated pattern of the same experience. And that's why it becomes more complex, because that is repeatedly experienced by someone, where one-off trauma is just a one-off traumatic event, which can no less do damage, but is somehow easy to navigate because it's just navigating with the one experience.
Yes.
So what was your question again?
So if it is relational trauma then, if it was, you know, if it happened when you were 6, 8, 10 and then 12, but then stopped, would you have to go back? Would part of the recovery process be seeking that person out that was involved in the trauma and then working out some sort of communication?
Not necessarily. I mean, look, I've had people do that, and what tends to happen more often than not is they get very defensive. Yeah. And very self-protective about things. And
you were,
or they just, you know, say, oh, I was a really bad parent. But they, because they haven't done the work on themselves, they can't engage in that emotional level that perhaps they need to kind of resolve it. I think, you know, I love the bus metaphor, right? Because the bus metaphor basically says that, you know, when these experiences happen to us, it's like our 6-year-old is governing our life and taking our life in a certain direction.
Wow.
So what I work towards is helping people to say, okay, you know, all these experiences you've been having, it's been these young wounded parts which have been driving the bus of your life. It's like, what does it mean for your adult to drive the bus? So, and again, this is about self-regulation and learning how to kind of hold all that experience. Is that, you know, if we can kind of hold all these younger parts and all the trauma that they experience, it's like the adult can kind of feel all these feelings, but learn how to process them and work through them in a way that enables them to kind of be free of that trauma pattern. So, you know, that's why, I mean, I use the bus metaphor a lot for people, because they don't even realise that younger parts of them are kind of, you know, railroading their experience. But I just want to say also that I think it depends on the trauma too.
Of course.
Just, you know, because I think if there's, say, really, you know, profound sexual trauma or something like that, you know, there might be some benefit in the person, I mean, not even necessarily confronting the parent, but part of their healing and empowering process might be in taking the matter further. I mean,
absolutely, absolutely seeking some, valid justice. Coming, even just the ability to update. Because I mean, the saddest thing about sexual abuse, sexual-based trauma, I guess, is that if you haven't done that work, you'll see it based upon how you saw the world as a child. I think the thing, without going too deep into the whole Michael Jackson sphere, the saddest thing, and I only watched the first part of it, but the way they spoke about how they loved him, these two kind of heterosexual fellas, and whatever they go for, it doesn't matter, but they spoke about how they loved him, and they loved him, and it's just fascinating how that perception can be locked onto that memory, where as an adult you would see that and be like, this guy was like abusing me, he was manipulating my mind, and that's a complicated thing, isn't it? Yeah.
It's really complicated. And I think, it's like trauma's a spectrum, right? And I think, I think all of us suffer some trauma to some degree. Yeah. So if we say, spectrum of trauma is here, and at the other spectrum, we have what we call DID, which is like a dissociative identity disorder. It's like parts of our psyche get so fragmented through the trauma and abuse that they form their own identities inside ourselves, and there's no integration between these parts. And but on the other end, it's more just, we function fine in the world, but we still have this slight fragmentation going on inside us, and we move internally. Sometimes you might notice, like, you'll want to move towards something, and then you'll have part of you say, oh, that's a great idea, let's do that. Another part saying, oh no, that's too scary, can't do that. No,
yes.
I'll go there. Or, whatever it might be, but that's just a more kind of subtle version of the same thing.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, man. Yeah, the way you describe that's ultra fascinating. That end of the spectrum stuff is, because it makes sense, that whole defense mechanism approach, the evolutionary circuits that drive us, to survive.
Exactly.
And I think what the unfortunate irony behind trauma is in relation to the primitive animal within us is that if we're still alive today, it thinks it's done its job, so for us to actually go back into like, hey, actually you didn't need to protect me there, you didn't need to protect me there, like, or trying to rewire that, so it's like, thank you for doing that, but I don't need to be protected every time something like that occurs or manifests itself, is challenging, especially when it's end of the spectrum stuff and you see people that have personality disorders because the defensive structure,
or the vulnerability.
Exactly. Well, yes.
The hidden vulnerability.
The hidden vulnerability. Yeah.
Becomes so separate and so protected.
And it's almost like a drastic defensive mechanism because they feel like they've needed to become this person to be able to get through that experience.
Exactly. And you really see that evolutionary thing that is in us does that exactly to help us get through those kind of environmental experiences. And the other thing, I find really interesting is that you really recognise that, children can't recognise that their parents are often traumatised, right?
Yeah.
And so they always think that there's something wrong with them and that they have to change. And so this is where, again, trauma can be so damaging to somebody because it's like, they're internalised that there's something fundamentally wrong with themselves.
Yeah.
Which is often not the case, it's more just that's what the reflection of the trauma is. Because they couldn't see their parents as being flawed. Yeah, definitely. Wounded.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was like 18 before I started to see my parents as like, oh shit, they're just humans too.
Yeah.
So no, they're not. They're my parents. They're my superheroes. Dad'll always have enough money. Mum will always have enough money. There will always be a house, If you could leave us with one bit of advice on how to start doing this work yourself, and sometimes, given where you are on the spectrum, it's very important that you go and seek a qualified therapist, obviously.
Sure.
We're not saying don't, but if you can start to explore your inner world, maybe not meditation, what's a way that people can start to become more self-aware?
Well, I think, as you said before, as we said earlier on, I think things like meditation helps us to connect into ourselves. But I think, you know, under the things like our gut feeling and our intuition are really kind of undervalued in the world. And I think, you know, our mind has become so strong. But I guess what I would encourage your listeners to think about is starting to trust their intuition a little bit more.
Okay. How do you do that? Like, what is your intuition? How do you?
Well, it's kind of just a felt sense of something. Again, it's not coming from here. It's coming. I mean, that's why I like gut feeling, because it feels like it's in the gut. You know, it's like something in our body is telling us like, this would be interesting to move towards. But I think it's also it's taking a bit of a risk. You know, and stepping out of our comfort zone and starting to look at possibilities around us that maybe we haven't previously considered.
Yes,
you know,
definitely.
and being prepared to do something different. Because I think humans like safety and security, you know, and we feel comfortable in our patterns of living and experience.
Sometimes so I understand them.
Yeah, well, you know, we feel safe in that.
Yeah.
But sometimes what we need is, like, I kind of call it like throwing a spanner into machinery. So really it's just shifting something in our energy to kind of experience ourselves differently. And sometimes, you know, that when we're talking about people that aren't very connected to their right brain, what I often do is I'll say, okay, so you've been doing this over and over again, experiencing this and this. What happens if you did this? And I say, you know, go out in the world and just do this and see what happens. And sometimes you just doing that one different thing, they'll experience something differently themselves.
Oh, I love that. So even just from a practical sense, like, if anyone's listening to this and they always take the same route home from work, maybe try to go a different way and see what would happen. I love it. Grant, where can people find you, and where can people get in contact with you if they want to speak to you, conscious counselling? Give us all the links, my friend.
Right. Yeah, so I've got two websites. I've got the conscious counselling website, but I've also got embodied soul psychotherapy. Okay. Yeah, which is probably tells you more about this kind of work and how I operate with it. So I'm based in Prahran, up in High Street. So basically, you know, they can call me on my phone, but basically best to go to the website and take a look and be interested and give me a call. Great. And that's in Melbourne. Do you do online work as well? I do Skype sessions with a few people. Yeah. You know, which works well. But I find that in person, you know, it's obviously the interpersonal space is a bit more there and experience. So definitely. You know, but that obviously distance sometimes plays a part, and so, you know, Skype is a good secondary option. Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Grant, thank you so much for doing the show, man. It was all. Did you have fun? Yeah. It's good. We got deep. Cool, mate. And that's a wrap.